Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. All those themes that come together that you speak of with the syllabus of errors, I mean, that's straight up medieval thought. Then you have the ideas of kind of the pseudoscience progressivism that come in with all this like weird eugenics stuff. Then you have the ideas of classical liberalism, of the Enlightenment, and all of the very best of those things and all of the very worst of them. And they're all working at the same time. It's like they put all of the very best ideas that had come along in the last several hundred years and all of the worst of them, and let's just put them all together, and they're all playing out at this time. I think we keep coming back to this. I don't think there's anywhere else that you see these kind of things playing out.
Yeah, I mean, one of the few places you can really point to, at least just off the top of my head, is maybe it's interesting because we're going to talk about it a little later, is maybe Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one of the most diverse countries on the face of the earth. Different religions, different belief systems, different cultures, different creeds, and they all came together in the end to oppose this Italian monster that was coming to invade them. But that's in the story to come. A lot of people from this point started losing faith, though, in the right-wing coalition, the Destra Storica, as it's called. And by 1876, the left finally comes to power under a guy named Agostino di Prentice. De Prentice was a Piedmontese, so it was a check in the king's box. I mean, that's fine. And the fact that he was able to be elected was actually a pretty good thing for Parliament. I mean, the fact that you're able to change power without, like severe violence or upheaval, it's a good thing. It's a positive thing for any kind of democracy. But with him in power, he attempts to make initial reforms, and he starts the age of transformism. So transformism, it's like the idea before. A lot of these ideas weren't set in stone. The left and right weren't cemented. The sides weren't aligned. There were no political parties even, really, because political parties were seen by most Italians as the reason why during the Renaissance and the medieval period that their city-states collapsed and became, fodder for the Spanish or the French. And you see transformism start to take over. This was the idea that if you change some ideas you had, you could get a spot at the table and you could push your ideas forward. In reality, this ended up just making Parliament seem even more useless, because now there's a bunch of people who are saying they're one thing, but then they're doing a completely different thing. And people who were elected on one principle now have to switch their principles to, get heard. It was a very interesting time. And with it came some initial reforms. I mean, he expanded the electorate, but it wasn't by much. Like 7% of the country could now vote as opposed to 3%. And he started to integrate the leftists into, the Italian story. He made different monuments to Garibaldi, Mazzini. He named different streets Roman names. There's like Cincinnatus, and there was the Cicero, different Romanesque secular things that really upset the Pope. Not just because, like you were saying, he was himself, at least at this point, by this time, a very reactionary person, but he saw that Rome was changing all around him and he could do nothing about it. The few things that he did do, the Pope, he had many followers and supporters who were extremely wealthy. The extremely wealthy religious conservatives bought up land in Rome, and they would buy like every other plot. So Rome was just this like giant mess of modern and classical designs. And in the end, Carducci says the Piedmontese did more to harm Rome than either of the sackings of the Goths or Vandals. Like they made it as ugly. Yeah. And Carducci is hilarious like that. He's a very interesting guy. He's a Nobel-winning laureate, but he was also an intense jingoist. I mean, this was one of the people who rode hard for Italian nationalism and in the future irredentism. And you see this flip-flop of parties, they only make the extremes more extreme and more vocal and more popular by extension. And with the increasing of the electorate, the first of the Italian socialists come to the play, with the first Italian Socialist Party coming in like 1885, I think, in Milan under a guy named Costa. And from there, they only grow in popularity, in spite of the best efforts of the people in charge, who absolutely, like, socialism is like, whoa, that's like the last thing. They would rather, and they do, they'd rather sign up with the ultra reactionaries than ever support a socialist country, especially in Italy. So after several years of this transformism of the left in power, things are trudging along. They end up getting rid of the grist tax, which is good for the regular people, but it leaves the Italian books completely plastered. I mean, they owe so much money, 8,000 million, I think is the number at this point, to the banks of France and England. And they had no real way to counteract this. They didn't propose new taxes. They didn't try to lower the military spending. They didn't try any of this. It was just trying to, keep the wheels turning. If you keep the wheels turning, that's all you needed. So some of the ways they try to go about making these Italians there's three ways. I talk about one a little bit early, the state. That's the main one. Next is education. And they do this with the Copino law, which I talked about. In the Copino law, it says all the teachers of Italy should know how to speak Italian. The guy who wrote it, Copino, who was the minister of education, went so far as to say that only teachers should be hired from Tuscany, because this spoken Tuscan was Italian. This obviously wasn't possible. So they go about re-educating the illiterate masses. This education, it usually doesn't stick because, for the most part, children weren't required in school. They had to be in the fields. They had to be at the shop. They had to have an extra source of income for their family, or else, the things could quickly fall apart. But with this new educational decree, you see that attendance is mandatory. There is mandatory physical education, and there's small stipends to these local municipalities toward their education. In reality, most of the teachings aren't really, they don't really stick. The kids would come home and they'd unlearn that the earth revolved around the sun, for example, from an ultra religious family member or direct family member. And with the streamlined Piedemontese guidance, the education system starts to slowly improve. It does improve, definitely. It's a lot better than what it was previously. But you see the main Italianization happening in the army. So with the army, conscription is the way. It's every male has to serve at least 3 years if they're approved. But you find when you tax people's food, they end up not being so healthy. So massive, like only 1 in 10 Sicilians were accepted into the army because they were so malnourished. They couldn't serve, but they were considered well enough to go work in the fields or go work in the mines or whatever. And this military change, it came as well with recruits being sent away. It was called Seeing Italy. They would send recruits from their home region to the north or the south, depending. And in reality, this ended up incredibly isolating Italian soldiers, especially who've never been to that part of the country before, didn't understand the language really, or the dialect. And you see Italian soldiers increasingly getting STDs. Like one of the main things that all Italian soldiers did on their first day was go to visit a brothel or go to visit a bar. This is a way that they let loose when they couldn't, they didn't have the money to spend at any of the shops or anything like that. So this was how they filled their time. This led to STDs, like I said, but increased isolation, and it culminated in, I think, 1882 with a guy named Mizdia. It's a really tragic modern episode. This guy, he barricaded himself in his room in the barracks, and he started firing off his rifle. He killed 5 soldiers. He wounded another 20 or something, and he was judged certifiable. Cesar Lombroso said so. I mean, he was driven mad by bullying, because in these barracks, all the northern soldiers would gang up on the southern soldiers who were in way less availability. So he was driven literally crazy by bullying, and this caused him to fire out his window. He was eventually executed by firing squad, which is it's a really sad and tragic episode in Italian history, and it shows the complacency of the powers that be. They didn't attempt to reform the system at all. They didn't attempt to change things about it. They were very set in their ways. One way they also tried to do it is through literature. A bunch of famous literature came out in this time that's Italian. Most famously, probably Pinocchio. It was written in 1888, I think, by Carlo Collodi. He at first he didn't really like the story. He was like, "You got to give me a lot of money for me to finish this, because I don't really want to do this." But it ended up becoming one of the most popular and pedagogic literature pieces of its time. The idea of a wooden boy who was carved from the imaginations of an old man, I think, fits perfectly with the symbolism of Italy too. Now, with all this in place, you see the estrema start to rise. This is the extreme. They're under a guy called Cavolotti. And Cavolotti he was a hard drinking, duel fighting poet. He fought 33 duels in his lifetime. Yeah. Whoa. And yeah, this was it was something that was, it was shied away from in Italian politics, but it's something that happened pretty regularly, honestly. You weren't in trouble for it if no one got hurt, but if someone got hurt, you ended up being in trouble for it. But otherwise, they were like, okay, everything's, you got it out of your system. That's good. But with Cavolotti, he's railing against the powers that be. His group is gaining in popularity nearly daily, and transformism is literally eating away at the fabric of democratic government. around this time, La Marmora passes. Then King Victor dies right afterward. And on his deathbed, the Pope forgives him, lifts the excommunicate against him, I believe. And within a few years, the Pope himself is dead too. His final words, he has a massive heart attack, or he has a massive seizure, which leads to a heart attack. And his final words were, defend the church that I upheld so gratefully or gracefully. If you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. I wonder, what I was always thinking is with Pius IX, the deal that the Italian government gives him is probably about as good of a deal as you can absolutely give someone. You can have this bit of land. It's not a ton of land, but it's his own property. The papacy gets to control certain churches around the city. They didn't really have to do any of that, but they also knew that there's a lot of Catholics around, and if they're too tough on him, that it's going to play well. But I think that Pius IX, I don't think he was a brilliant tactician. I don't think he was a brilliant person with any of the political person, but I think he really understood messaging and the public relations. He won the PR battle because he could explain his situation in a minute, but it took them 3 minutes to explain theirs. And even though their position was really reasonable in a lot of ways, they couldn't get the message across. There was a person who said that the person who takes 3 minutes to explain their position is never going to beat the person who can explain theirs in one. He had a very straightforward narrative that I'm a prison of the Vatican, and it played well to the people throughout the entire Catholic world who weren't there, didn't see all of the nuance, and they didn't really have to understand the nuance because he gave a very straightforward narrative that I'm a prisoner. This is all persecution. They really couldn't argue against that. What do you think? Would you push back at all or do you think that he won the propaganda victory? He won the public relations victory?
Oh yeah, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, I mean, considering the mess that was Italian politics at this time, it wouldn't have been hard to win any sort of battle against such a state. Especially, I mean, he had it was true everything he was saying. He was technically a prisoner. He did have his temporal authority removed. All this stuff did happen. It's not like he was lying about it. He didn't make it up. I mean, he didn't blow the wall in the Aurelian walls. That was all the Italian government, and the Italian government deserves a lot of the criticism for the way they handled taking Rome. They handled taking Venice, because they could have taken Venice peacefully, but they chose not to. They wanted to have a war because that's what they felt would unite the country. If they had some common enemy to rally around, then Italians could finally be made. But in the end, it ended up hurting them even more. And you see the immense power that the church still holds in Italy. I mean, since the 1929 Concordat with the fascists, the Italian Catholic Church has been the church religion of Italy, literally.
Yeah, I think to this day they have to have a cross in each classroom, and there's in a secular school that's how deeply ingrained it came in. And it's really that that Pius IX he was so intransigent. It worked in his favor, being so absolutely, he would not budge at any point, even though he was really he lost all the, battle after battle after battle, physical, actual literal battle, but also political battle, but he was still able to come out on top. It's a pretty amazing story when you think of it.
He lost all the battles, but he won the war. I mean, that's there's plenty of examples of that throughout history, definitely. But yeah, with the passing of all these people.
Yeah, that's a big move. Everybody's gone now.
Everyone dies within like 5 years. I mean, is the king, there's the general, there's the Pope, and Garibaldi dies a little bit after that too. So there's these four massive chess pieces that just fell down, and the left in power is left to pick up the pieces. They are able to hyperdrive the cult of the state now, because the king was able to do a lot more in his death than he did when he was actually alive to unite the country. I mean, in his life, he was kind of like a silly guy. Like there was criticism against him. He had like dye running down his hair into his shirt because he colored his hair. He was an infamous adulterer. I mean, he was joked as literally the father of the nation. Like that's what people would joke about him as. And this was the way that he was viewed. And in his death, 200,000 people went to visit his funeral, or went along with it on the way to Rome. And 6 years later, there was another pilgrimage of the same amount of people on Rome to celebrate the king's death. And replacing him was his first son, Umberto. He chose Umberto I. Thankfully, he didn't choose Umberto IV, which a lot of Piedmontese people wanted, so they could continue the line of Savoy. But he luckily chose Umberto I. And the second he's in power, the new political situation shows itself. He's nearly assassinated by a knife-wielding assailant. The queen, his first cousin, has to throw a bouquet of flowers into the assailant's face. And the prime minister, who fought in Garibaldi's campaigns, ends up disarming the guy. And the way this guy's treated, not Gaetano Bresci, I'm not sure about his name, but if you were to look it up, the way he was treated after the fact, completely horrendous. At first, he was given the death sentence, but they communicated that. They placed him underneath sea level, in a prison underneath sea level, tortured him, abused him for hours, 24 hours solitary confinement. Fishermen around the island where he was interred said they could hear him screaming from the walls. It's really terrible how they treated this guy. And of course, he broke the law. I mean, he tried to kill somebody. But still, it's like, wow, this is the level that the government is ready to go against people who do the wrong thing. And this guy was an anarchist. He believed in the propaganda of the deed, which was a famous, it was a famous idea put forward by the Italian John Brown, Carlo Piscani. He said, deeds arise from action, not the other way around. And this was the calling card of decades and decades of anarchist agitation against the powers that be, and numerous assassination attempts, a lot of them successful. The president of the United States, William McKinley, is killed by an assassin's bullet, as well as the
Garfield, yeah.
Garfield is killed by an assassin's bullet as well. On top of this, the King of Spain is killed by an assassin. Umberto, he survives this one, but eventually he gets got by an assassin who was also an anarchist. And this was spreading all thanks to a guy named Mikhail Bakunin. He's very famous Russian anarchist, famous for writing the Bread Book. I believe that was him, and putting forward the idea that any property whatsoever is theft. So you have the right, being a natural citizen of the world, to put your action to power and take down the powers that be through violence, because that's the only way it's going to happen, at least for these leftists. The main person that Italy now transitions to is Umberto's wife, who, as I said, was his first cousin, Margherita. There's the very famous legend of Margherita, the Margherita pizza, where she had like a pizza contest, and someone brought the pizza with tomato sauce, the cheese, and the basil, which is what is called the Margherita pizza now. And she said, "Oh, this pleases me the most because it reminds me of the Italian flag." That never happened, but it just shows the level of the occult that was slowly being built around the state. Now, with Pope Pius's death, Leo XIII ascends as well in Rome. You might want to talk about Leo a little bit. He seems like a very, very interesting character. Definitely a lot more moderate than Pius. He seemed to be on a very level head in terms of, the level of the popes, considering Pope Pius IX, and then following him, Pope Pius X, who was also very illiberal. Leo seems to be a very even keel character in this drama. He eases the papal decree against secretly. He eases the papal decree against Catholics voting, because for the longest time Catholics were unallowed to vote. Were not allowed to vote. It didn't stop them, obviously. I mean, after the decree was lifted, much longer in the future, the voting numbers didn't change at all. They were the same. So really, Catholics were voting the whole time. But yeah, maybe you can talk about Leo the 13th.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Well, we can keep, in a lot of ways, Leo the 13th is beyond where we're going to be going. But I think that it shows that there is a modernization going. All of these popes still kind of clung to that idea that they were prisoners of the Vatican, and it won't be until that Concordat in 1929. But things are starting to change in that the papacy is becoming more modern, and they're still holding on to some of those vestiges of that were prisoners of the Vatican, and that some of these ideas of clinging to because it took such a long time for the papacy to enter modernity, that there's still going to be vestiges of these old ideas that they've hung on to of being against everything modern, but they're slowly turning into the papacy that we'll see today, that they're more theological. It's more based on the religion, and they're kind of, to use the modern parlance, they're more of an NGO, a non-governmental organization, that they're going to have this soft power. And from my readings of Leo the 13th, he's easing into those ideas, and it's a transition into the popes that we'll see in the 50s and the 60s, and even up until John Paul II. They don't have any secular power, but they have a soft power. We're starting to see that in the end of the 19th century, going into the early 20th century. You can see where that's going to come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see his teaming up with more liberals against socialism, because socialism by this point has become the number one boogeyman. Before it used to be liberalism and railroads and gaslighting or whatever. Now it was the overwhelming force of collectivization, which was really, really, it was going crazy in places like Romagna, which was very famous for having a lot of agitation. And these anarchists and socialist ideas worked super well in Italy because they were so well known for having violent peasant uprisings. And this is throughout time. I mean, you can look at any century and see a dozen different ones.
I chuckle a little bit when you say gaslighting. It's literal gaslighting. It's light. It's lighting with natural gas or whatever. I don't remember what the exact chemical gas is, but that was something that that popes in the early 1800s fought against, of putting in modern things like gaslight. And I mean, we're not even talking electricity. We're talking about just putting in railroads, like you had mentioned earlier, that there was almost zero mileage of railroad track in the Papal States. And that's how far behind they were. These sections of Italy that they didn't have canals. They didn't have all these technologies that in the early 1800s made places like Great Britain explode, and industrially, and parts of Germany and parts of even northern Italy, the United States. All these basic technologies of gaslight, of railroads, of canals, they didn't have any of it. They're starting off at basically zero.
Yeah, it's very much like a system of mercantilism. I mean, you see, my next series is on Puerto Rico, so I'm very in depth in the colonial sort of mind games that were played. But Italy was a perfect example of colonialism on the continent of Europe. I mean, their resources were sent away. The silk that was. I mean, Italy controls maybe a third of the silk production of the entire world. That was all sent away. The exports of wool and wine, they were all sent away. There was no resource building inside the country itself. It was all sent to foreign markets. It was sent to the metropolis of Spain or the metropole of France in the Napoleonic times or Austria, and this is how it remains so poor. And on top of it, like you were saying, the theological state that literally existed right in the smack dab middle of it, that kept the two halves from really connecting with each other in any sort of economic way. It's a good way for me to transition now to Italian foreign policy, because you see Italian foreign policy at this time. It's in the left, they support basically the French. That's their whole thing. They're Francophiles. They send France almost 50% of all Italian exports. So France is the number one power in terms of the versus Italy. But they see very quickly that this relationship starts to go sour. In 1878, there's the Congress of Berlin, which is more or less a partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. There's massive rebellions in modern day Bulgaria, which leads to the state of Bulgaria that we know it today, but it's massively expanded. There are Greeks and Macedonians and Serbians who are part of Bulgaria who want nothing to do with this country. So the powers of Europe come together. They set about sorting this out. They decrease the size of Bulgaria to its modern day borders. Britain is given Cyprus, super important strategic island in the middle of the Mediterranean. France is secretly given the go-ahead to invade all of North Africa, basically. Russia gets Bulgaria recognized, obviously. Austria becomes the protectorate of Bosnia, Herzegovina. At this, the Italian diplomat asked for Trentino. If Austria is going to get aggrandized in the east, we should get a little bit of Austria in the west. This is, after all, probably 50-50 split, 50% Italian-speaking, 50% German-speaking. At this, the Russian ambassador basically pulls a joke on his expense. He said, "Oh, what battle did Italy lose that they want more land?" And this pisses off the diplomat of Italy. And for the rest of the Congress, he doesn't assert his position. Italy's left with nothing. They're hoping to get at least Tunisia, but by 1882, that gets invaded by France, and general conflict between the two countries is stopped barely. I mean, it was almost a full general war in North Africa over Tunisia. Tunisia itself was a huge part of the Italian diaspora. There were thousands and thousands of Italians living in Tunisia under the Bey's protection. Not only that, economic interests in Tunisia were astronomical. The Italian economists and early nationalists wanted Tunisia, not just because of the things I mentioned, but because it used to be the home of Carthage. It used to be the breadbasket of the entire Roman Empire. This was considered it was a staple of Italy to control this. They needed this. This was a part of who they were. And this is where the irredentist movement really begins.